The front door came off the hinges at 3:11 in the morning. I know the exact time because I have a digital clock on the nightstand that glows red in the dark, and when the sound hit, the first thing my eyes found was those numbers, 3:11. Then the shouting started. Federal search warrant! Everyone on the ground! I didn't reach for a weapon. I later learned Madison had flagged me as an immediate flight risk, lying to the agents that I planned to wipe the corporate servers and flee the country by dawn. I reached for my glasses. As the tactical lights blinded me, I looked past the barrels of the rifles and saw my wife, Madison, standing in the hallway. She wasn't screaming. She was holding her phone, the lens pointed directly at my face, recording the exact moment my professional life ended. I realized then that I wasn't being arrested, I was being erased. If the person you shared a bed with for 10 years was filming your downfall instead of screaming for help, would you assume it was a mistake or a masterclass in betrayal? Cold steel has a way of focusing the mind. The ride to the county station took exactly 14 minutes, and I spent every one of them auditing my wife's performance. Through the reinforced glass of the patrol car, I watched Madison lower her phone. She didn't look at me as I was driven away. She walked back toward our house with the measured rhythmic steps of someone who had just checked a difficult item off a very long list. Looking back now, I can see the clinical precision in her posture, the way she kept the lens level to capture the federal patches on the agents' vests and the zip ties biting into my skin. She wasn't recording a tragedy. She was curating an exhibit for a custody hearing. At the time, I didn't realize how deep the preparation work went. I sat in silence as the dark streets of the city rolled past, my brain clicking through the logic of the raid like a series of interlocking gears. 22 years of high-stakes corporate compliance had stripped me of the ability to feel fear in the traditional sense. Panic is a luxury I never learned how to afford. In my world, when the building is on fire, you don't scream bellowing, only waste oxygen. You look for the nearest exit and calculate the rate of the burn. I was in observation mode, not recovery mode. The station was a fortress of fluorescent lights and the smell of industrial floor cleaner, lemon, and bleach. They led me to a processing area, removed the ties, and took my prints. Then came the interview room. Beige walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and a camera in the corner with a red light that meant my silence was being digitized. I had been in rooms like this 1,000 times, but always on the other side of the table, looking for the telltale sweat on a chief financial officer's upper lip. Now, I was the one sitting in the plastic chair. If I'm being honest, the most unsettling part wasn't the cuffs or the charges. It was the young officer who brought me a paper cup of water. He set it down without making eye contact, his movements jerky and filled with the kind of disdain usually reserved for those who steal from widows. He saw a high-level fraudster, a man who had laundered $32 million through a biotech firm. He saw a criminal who was finally caught. He had no idea he was looking at the only man in the building who truly understood how the crime had been committed. I realized then that Madison hadn't just set a trap. She had attempted to rewrite my entire identity. Some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating, and I had been the silent investor in her version of our family for far too long. I sat back, let the water go warm, and waited for the real auditor to walk through the door. 10 years is a long time to ignore your instincts. Looking back now, I realize I had been the silent architect of a legacy that was never intended to be mine. When I first stepped into the offices of Henderson and Cole, the firm was a chaotic ecosystem of clerical negligence and impending federal disasters. I spent thousands of hours over the last 10 years applying my clinical training to their ledger, fixing the systemic leaks that would have otherwise invited a full-scale liquidation. I believed that by providing a framework of integrity, I was securing a future for the woman I loved. I vividly recall the evening Madison handed me a heavy silver fountain pen to celebrate my promotion to lead compliance director. It was cool in my hand, engraved with my initials. At the time, I didn't realize it wasn't a token of appreciation. It was a down payment on my silence. She didn't want a partner who could fix the firm. She wanted a shield to hide behind while she harvested $32 million in stolen clinical data. It took me years to understand that Madison didn't merely resent the rules she hated, that I was the rules. I was the recurring audit she couldn't bypass. Then there was Caleb. While Madison spent his childhood teaching him how to manage his image for the right social circles, I spent mine teaching him how to manage the truth. I spent my weekends helping him with his calculus and showing him how to find the errors in a complex equation. I wanted him to be the kind of man who could look at a balance sheet or a person and see exactly what was missing. If I'm being honest, I think that's what frightened Madison the most. She realized that Caleb was beginning to admire my clinical transparency more than her manufactured prestige. I had convinced myself that my presence was a stabilizing force, but I was merely the unpaid janitor for her moral decay. This is the quiet danger of marriage to an opportunist. You spend so much time carrying their weight that you eventually forget what it's like to stand up straight. I sat in that sterile interview room, staring at the humming clock, and realized that my integrity had become an overdrafted account. Madison thought she was closing the book on me at 3:11 that morning, but she had no idea that I had spent the last 6 months preparing a file that would serve as her professional autopsy. Madison entered the interrogation room at 7:15 a.m. Not as a wife, but under a legal loophole Silas had engineered to discuss urgent corporate assets before my formal arraignment. She wasn't wearing the look of a worried wife. She was wearing the expression of a chief executive officer overseeing a forced liquidation. She was still in that silk robe. I had bought her a garment meant for intimacy, now repurposed into a uniform of betrayal. Behind her stood Silas, a high-priced corporate fixer who specialized in making the truth as malleable as a damp piece of clay. They didn't ask how I was. They didn't offer comfort. They presented a document. The deal was as clinical as it was insulting. If I signed over my entire interest in the patent holding company, shares currently valued at over $32 million, Madison would miraculously find the evidence to exonerate me. She suggested that the FBI might have overlooked a crucial set of files that she had recently discovered on our home server. It was a classic exchange of capital for liberty. Looking back now, I realize her confidence was the ultimate symptom of her pathology. She truly believed that every person, every principle, and every federal investigation had a price tag attached to it. When I didn't reach for the pen, she switched to a different currency, Caleb. She leaned in, her perfume a suffocating floral wall in that cramped room, and told me that Caleb was disgusted. She said he had watched the video. She took the one where I was dragged out in zip ties and that he never wanted to speak to me again. She threatened to use that same footage to secure a permanent protection order, effectively erasing 10 years of fatherhood with a single thumb drive. At that moment, I saw the full scope of the illusion she lived in. This was the narcissistic injury in real time. She wasn't just greedy. She was offended that I dared to possess a moral compass that she couldn't break. If I'm being honest, it was the first time I felt a flicker of genuine pity for her. She was operating on the hollow illusion that power is something you can buy or steal rather than something you earn through character. To her, I was just a line item to be zeroed out of her legacy. She had normalized her own cruelty so thoroughly that she couldn't see the technical errors in her plan. I sat there, hands resting flat on the metal table, and declined to sign. Madison's lawyer whispered that I wouldn't survive the audit, but he was wrong. I was the audit. The truth has a distinct digital signature. After Madison and her attorney left, the heavy steel door opened again, and Special Agent Harper walked in. He didn't look like a man who believed in miracles. He looked like a man who had spent 20 years listening to the desperate lies of high-level fraudsters. He set a thick folder on the metal table and sat down, his expression as clinical as my own. I didn't beg for my freedom. I didn't offer a frantic alibi. I simply waited for him to open the file. I looked at the incriminating emails Madison had provided the digital trail that supposedly linked me to a $32 million money laundering operation. I didn't look at the content. I looked at the architecture. My years in corporate compliance had taught me that a trap is only effective if the target believes they are the one in control. Looking back now, I realize that Madison's greatest error was assuming my silence over the last 10 years was a lack of awareness rather than a strategy. Look at the server identification tags on those headers, Agent, I said quietly. Harper paused, his eyes narrowing. I pointed to a string of numbers at the bottom of the page. Those emails were supposedly sent in August of 2023. However, the server identification listed in the metadata belongs to a private network that I took offline in October of 2023. Whoever forged these used an old template and failed to update the digital timestamp. It was a ghost in the machine, a recurring error that only a trained auditor would catch. I then pointed out the company logo on the client invoices. Madison used the firm's current rebranded logo, failing to realize the alleged transactions took place 2 years prior under our legacy branding. I saw the first crack in Harper's skepticism. He didn't say anything, but his eyebrows lifted by a fraction of an inch, a professional sign that I had just given him a logic error he couldn't ignore. But I wasn't finished. I leaned forward, my voice dropping into a calm, authoritative register. Madison didn't just frame me for the theft, I told him. She just submitted forged clinical trial data to federal regulators. That isn't a civil dispute anymore. It's a federal felony. I explained the honeypot. 6 months ago, I suspected Madison was siphoning clinical data to benefit her partner, an attorney named Silas. I didn't stop her. Instead, I salted the data. I replaced the genuine, high-value formulas with a sophisticated, plausible-looking, but medically impossible data set. If I'm being honest, I wanted to see if she would actually pull the trigger. She did. Every document she had provided the FBI, every patent application she had filed in the last 90 days was built on a foundation of salted data. Madison thought she was stealing a $32 million legacy. Instead, she was holding a ticking time bomb that, once filed with the government, triggered an automatic fraud investigation. Agent Harper looked at the log I had pointed out for a long minute. The fluorescent lights in the room hummed, and the air felt suddenly thinner as the scale of the fraud Madison had attempted became clear. Some forms of leverage stay invisible until they are triggered, and I had just pulled the pin. Harper looked up at me, his face unreadable. "I need to call our forensic technician," he said. "If you are lying, Nathan, you just added 5 years to your sentence. Real power doesn't need to shout to be felt." At 11:45 a.m., the forensic technician walked into the bullpen with a look of profound confusion. He confirmed what I already knew. The metadata in Madison's evidence was a digital collage of lies. Agent Harper didn't apologize. He simply handed me my watch and wedding ring. The silver pen stayed in an evidence bag, a cold metallic witness to a marriage that no longer existed. We didn't talk much on the drive back to the house. I sat in the passenger seat of his unmarked SUV, watching the familiar landscape of the city return to its proper order. When we pulled into the driveway, Madison's white Lexus was parked at an arrogant angle. I could see her through the kitchen window, sitting at the table with Silas. They were likely calculating how to divide the $32 million they thought they had secured. As Agent Harper and 3 other officers stepped onto the porch, Madison opened the door. She was still wearing the silk robe, the one she had used as a costume for my downfall earlier that morning. She smiled when she saw me, assuming the agents were bringing me back to sign the final surrender of my patents. "I'm glad you came to your senses, Nathan," she said, her voice dripping with normalized cruelty she had practiced for years. She didn't notice the second patrol car pulling up behind us. She didn't notice Agent Harper reaching for his real cuffs. Looking back now, the symbolic irony was absolute. She was caught in the same lens she had tried to use as a weapon. The narcissistic injury was visible on her face the moment Harper read her the rights for patent fraud and tampering with a federal investigation. She didn't scream. She went still, her eyes darting to Silas, who was already backing away toward his car. It took me years to understand that people like Madison don't fear the truth. They fear the loss of the image. The truth destroys. I walked past her into the house to find Caleb. Madison had told me he was disgusted, but I knew my son better than she did. He was sitting on the back porch, staring at the trees. When he saw me, he didn't run. He just stood up and exhaled 10 years of held breath. I showed him the legacy protocol folder I had hidden in the subfloor of my office. It wasn't just an evidence file, it was his future. Every dollar of his college fund was there, protected and separate from the biotech scandal. If I'm being honest, I spent a lot of time wondering what a world without my intervention would have looked like. Without the salted data and the honeypot I had built 6 months ago, I would be sitting in a federal cell right now, and Caleb would be penniless, a victim of his mother's $32 million delusion. Madison looked at me through the glass of the cruiser as they drove her away. She finally realized that the compliance director she had dismissed as boring was the only person who had been actually protecting the family. Consequences are rarely as loud as the crimes that precede them. Looking back now, the trial of Madison and Silas felt less like a dramatic courtroom battle and more like a slow clinical cleanup of a hazardous spill. The federal prosecutor used the very salted data I had planted to dismantle every defense they attempted. Madison was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for patent fraud and tampering with a government investigation. Silas, who had orchestrated the shell company network, received 7 years. They were no longer the power brokers of the biotech world. They were just numbers in a database. The fallout for Henderson and Cole was absolute. The scandal surrounding the $32 million patent fraud forced the firm into a messy, involuntary dissolution. I lost my position and my salary, of course. In the eyes of the biotech inner circle, my name was forever linked to the breach, regardless of my innocence. Real life does not always provide a clean slate after a win. I had to work twice as hard to build a new name as an independent consultant, proving my integrity to clients one audit at a time. But the financial loss was a small price to pay for the legacy I managed to salvage. Caleb is now 18 years old and a freshman at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He chose to live with me rather than stay with Madison's parents, a decision he made with the same quiet certainty I had seen him use in his calculus homework. We had a long talk on the porch the night before he left for school. He told me that for 10 years he had watched his mother perform a character, but he had watched me live one. That is when I realized that family is not a matter of shared DNA, it is a matter of shared truth. It took me years to understand that you cannot fix a person who views your honesty as an obstacle. I had been the silent investor in Madison's version of family for far too long, footing the emotional bill for a subscription that had long since expired. My withdrawal from her scheme was the only way to save Caleb from the same moral bankruptcy. We still visit Madison once a month at the Federal Correctional Facility. I do this for Caleb's sake, ensuring he understands that the truth does not need to be cruel to be final. I am sitting in my new, modest apartment now, looking at the city skyline. The silver fountain pen is still on my desk, but I no longer see it as a bribe. I see it as a reminder that the tools of your trade are only as good as the hand that holds them. The silver mark of integrity is not something you inherit. It is something you forge in the quiet moments when no one is recording. The clock on the wall just hit 3:11 p.m. Have you ever experienced a moment where you realized the person you trusted most was actually the architect of your downfall? Did you find the strength to stand your ground and let the facts speak for themselves, or are you still waiting for your 3:11 a.m. moment to turn into a 3:11 p.m. piece? If this story resonated with you, I would really like to hear your perspective on how you reclaimed your own narrative.